benign and less specific in terms of its faith orientation, then they needed to be aware that that also came with it consequences with certain stakeholders. And perhaps they made that calculated decision and said, we know there will be fallout, but this is what we want to do. I don't know that. I don't know what the discussion was, but I sure hope that there were people in the room who took a look at all the different stakeholders and went through that analysis and developed ways to communicate with them. But they can't expect that people who are aligned with their institution as donors, and they're aligned for a particular reason, which might be the faith-based aspect, are going to continue to support them if they dilute their values or change them. That's the prerogative of the donor, of course. And so these are tough things. Organizations go through it all the time. Was that too long?
I'm just letting Doug collect his thoughts.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. We'll edit that out. But one of the aspects of the reaction, and actually we still want to talk about the initial decision, and it's since it's the one I guess that I noticed the most was when the news broke, there was especially on what I guess you would qualify as the conservative right, a particularly negative reaction on social media. And I would imagine that, Duke probably felt a lot of that social media backlash to some extent, and I wonder, if you can speak to how that audience, the extent to which that audience is relevant in how an institution like Duke needs to deal with issues like this.
Well, I had a client recently that had a little bit of a situation, and they were going to have to make a very tough, and it's a high-profile enterprise. They were going to have to make a tough decision that was going to create backlash, regardless of what the decision was. And so what we did is we walked through that decision, what we projected the backlash to be, and how we would respond to that backlash. And so we were prepared for it. And when it happened, and there was a social media flare-up, no one flinched. Everyone was prepared for it, not surprised. And I tell people about social media. In the Duke case, for example, maybe it's not just cowering to pressure because so many Facebook likes to a particular post by Franklin Graham. Maybe it wasn't just that they felt like the numbers were there, but maybe real counterpoints that they hadn't considered in their deliberation surface. So I'm not so cynical to think that it's just because there was some trending things on Twitter that caused them to push. Maybe it was new information, new perspectives, new opinions that they hadn't previously considered. But that's the great thing about social media. We can complain about it all day long, but it's a voice for people who didn't have a voice previously, and it's a way for companies, organizations, universities like Duke to listen. We always think of it as a broadcast, but for me, it's very much a listening tool, and it's a way for me to hear what people are saying, and sometimes you have to adjust course based on that.
Well, and you made an interesting point earlier, about the various communities, or I forget the exact term you used, that Duke has to think about when it makes decisions like this, students, alumni, donors, etc. And those are obviously their three most important constituencies. But in the end, where does the opinion of the social media world of people who never don't go to Duke, don't have children at Duke, and the most they know about Duke is the basketball team. Where really should that fit in when they're considering, a decision like this that might arouse some kind of public controversy?
They shouldn't consider that at all, except to the extent that those people who are not affiliated in any way with the university have good points to make. So it shouldn't be based on the heat that they're getting, but rather the substance. And if you make a decision, any company or enterprise, you make a decision and new information comes to light or things you hadn't considered and you have to reverse course, it doesn't really matter where that data comes from. It can come from social media, it can come from conventional media, it can come from watchdog groups. It doesn't really matter. But the problem they face is this flip-flopping. And that's what we're seeing with a lot of things. The NFL is a great example with the way they handled the Ray Rice case. And that's where institutions lose credibility, because it does start looking like they don't stand for values. They don't stand for their missions. They are simply chasing public opinion. In the Duke case, they could look like they were trying to chase the opinion that academic institutions should be as tolerant of all faiths as possible. And so they're kind of chasing that trend, and they admit that that's a national trend in some of their communication. Then they get the backlash, and they're chasing that constituency that includes a lot of alumni. Instead, you always want the appearance to be, we are standing by our values, this is our mission, these are our tenets, and this is where we're grounded, not in what the public is trying to get us to do or not do. And so, in this case, social media might have only mattered in the sense that people brought up some good points. I hope it wasn't just because a lot of people liked the post that they changed their mind.
Okay, you're talking about social media, and that zeroes in a little bit more than what I was interested in, Dan. I have a standing theory that the internet is destroying the world. You can agree with that or disagree with it, but we do seem to be mixing politics and social discussion. Do you think that a university, that a college, and we could probably expand this discussion to a number of other areas, is that an appropriate place for politics? I mean, should universities be?
You faded out a little bit there, but I would say yes. I mean, I think in my view of a university is that it's an incubator for ideas and for thought, and that should universities be engaging in political activism, that's different. But, universities have always been a hotbed for political discussion. I mean, you think about Vietnam War. I mean, so much of the protest came from universities. I mean, we had a lot of incidents on campuses. And so to me, I think that is where you bring young minds and the encouraging of free thought and open discussion, and I think that's the perfect place for it to happen. In my opinion, that's just Dan Hill.
No, let me follow up with that for a second, Dan.
Okay.
I don't mean the students. I think college life, that's an absolutely great time to get involved in activism. But what we brought you on to talk about is how Duke and I hesitate to keep using the phrase, Duke as a business, how they handle the reactions that they face from these things. I don't mean the students. The students should certainly be involved in social discourse. But do you see no areas where politics seems to poison the educational process, where perhaps they should try to insulate themselves from the various protests that go on around the country, whether it's racial protests or spending and taxation and all these other things, and particularly when you get into dodgy areas like religion, where there are so many sensitivities? Might it not be better to put your foot forward, saying, you know what, that's not what we're focusing on. We're providing a quality education. we're not here to debate what religion is better than another one, because it seems to me Duke is kind of leaving themselves open to some harsh criticism because they're choosing to.
Well, several things. One is that I don't know. I mean, I think that it's totally appropriate, in my opinion, for even the professors to encourage the students to engage in the discussions that are relevant to today. And so if that's the situation in Ferguson or something going on in religious free thought, then I don't have any issue with that. That said, Duke has not handled this well at all, and I totally, there are a lot of things they should have done differently. If they have backtracked and they feel comfortable with their backtracked position, then they should have never made the first decision, which means the process is flawed. We see that a lot with organizations where they come out with a policy that wasn't well thought through, doesn't read the current temperature, and doesn't take into account what certain stakeholders might say or how they might react, and they have to change course. And so Duke has done a disservice to its students, including its Muslim students. I mean, they did them a very big disservice by coming out with this statement that they've created this policy to allow them this right on Fridays, and then they have to backtrack from that. And so in the process of trying to please one group on campus, they've now offended all groups. And so obviously you want to avoid that. But I don't think encouraging universities to steer clear of the current events or debating the issues of the day, even at the faculty level, I don't know. I think I rely on academics from time to time who can help with policy issues that clients are facing and so forth. And I think because they are paying attention to what's going on today, they are more relevant, and I find their views occasionally useful, though very academic, which read whatever you want into that, but not always as practical as maybe others.
Well, and actually, you make, Darren, you made one good point, and that is the Muslim students on campus. And I was unable to find a number on this, but obviously there is a growing Muslim community at Duke University. They have, I noticed on their website, a Muslim Life Association, I believe it's called, that is made up of both students and faculty who are Muslim, who obviously have, formed together, to discuss the issues that affect them. And, obviously that adds yet another constituency that they have to keep in mind. And I guess, which leads to the issue of when an institution like Duke finds its demographics changing, how does it deal with that in a way that, both addresses the desires, or in some case the religious, in some cases, the religious obligations of the newer members of the community without offending everyone else, I guess is the best way to put it.
Well, that's the challenge. And here, I think it's important for listeners to recognize, in case they're not familiar, that this is not Duke saying that Muslim students cannot practice their faith or meet or congregate. It was simply a Friday act where they were going to go from the watchtower, or not the watchtower, but the bell tower, and they were going to have a speaker and a microphone to do a chant to start the week of prayer. As far as I know, Christian students aren't doing that on campus. They're not reciting the Lord's Prayer or